Hello, you beautiful, awakened and evolving souls. Welcome to another episode of this series of the Law of One concepts. Today, we're going to talk about space and time, and more precisely, space-time and time-space, which is something that they use in the raw material to explain the combination of these two dimensions that we know we exist in and how they interact with each other. So this is going to be a video shorter than usual because there's not much to say but to explain a couple of things. However, I do want to bring it to explain and play a little bit more with the concept of space-time and time-space, especially consciousness, which is really my thing. Before we start, the caveat, this is just an introductory description of what space-time and time-space is. If you want to learn more, of course, I invite you to read the material or watch my videos, which I do make a lot of them on the Law of One. And interestingly, next week will be released my next episode on the Law of One, session 57, a special one that I made for question 33, if I remember correctly the number, and is talking about time, space, and space-time. So if you're interested, don't forget to check that video out. It's going to come out next week. And if you're watching this already after the fact, then I welcome you to watch it already because it's already there. And I'll probably leave it here for you as well. So with that, remember, we're going to get into the description of space and time just as an introductory description. But I want to at least read you what Ra has said, and that's something that you can find in one of my videos already. So let's see what Ra says specifically when Don asked the question about space-time and time-space. In question 20 of session 41, Don asks, could you tell me the difference between space-time and time-space? Ra says, using your words, the difference is that between the visible and invisible, or the physical and metaphysical. Using mathematical terms, as does the one you call Larson, the difference is that between ST and TS. Now I know that wasn't very helpful from Ra, but it does give us a hint in terms of the visible and the invisible. And that's where we encounter the majority of the content being centered around when they talk about space-time. They're talking about the visible, the physical manifestation of this reality. So our physicality, we reside in space-time in our current human body, whereas in time-space is our mind, our thoughts, our imagination, and of course our soul. Everything that we call the energy centers are also manifested there. So there are two sides of the same coin, of the same reality, or grand illusion, as Ra calls it too. And the purpose of the difference of the two becomes a little bit more clear as we get into the study, but I'll give you a little bit more details on that, as it's going to make sense because that's really what we're here for. So we have what is the visible, which is our physical, and you can relate it to this, the physical world. That would be space-time. And then there is time-space of our thoughts, basically where our mind is working on. It's working always in time-space. Our feelings are also part of time-space, and you can see the interaction between the physical and the metaphysical, as Ra calls it too. Another thing that is important to mention, as Ra said it in the question, that it comes from the physics of Dewey Larson, somebody that Don was very aware of his work, and he decided to include him in the discussion with Ra, and Ra definitely agreed with those concepts, even though they said that they weren't as fully descriptive, of course, because we are limited by our conscious mind and everything else. But it suffices for the work of what space-time and time-space is. So in a little bit more depth, we're talking about inner and outer planes as well. That would be our inner planes, would be the ones where, say, all the entities that reside in time-space, that would be our inner planes. And as you know, there are different planes between which we can divide it into 7, would be the common division. as the densities. As we have 7 densities, we have 7 inner planes in our density of consciousness, which is third density. And this is where you would see or read that Ra says that there are entities residing from your inner planes. Or for example, I believe it was the book Urantia that was transmitted by inner plane beings. And so these are beings that reside in the different planes, and you would see them, or you would feel them as the lower planes. They would be called the astral planes, and the higher planes, which are the devachanic or devachanic planes. And these are where I would call the angels reside, and the lower ones would be where the demons reside. I mean, those terms are a little bit archaic at this point, but you get the point of this. It's almost like the negative, or not even the negative, but the needy ones, the one that need energy, are at the lower astral planes, and then in the higher planes, there resides those that just want to give. And so there are, of course, this is also the planes, the inner planes, at least talking about the third density, where entities go when they die and they do their revision and much work of healing and so on. This is all done within the inner planes that are a match to the space-time that is this third density. And so you can see already the inner works. When you have your guides, for example, your guides, your spirit guide, and so on, they reside in the inner planes, whereas the outer planes is always this, the physical reality. Paranormal effects of that kind is always a mix and sometimes a permeation of the inner planes to the outer planes. So this is another way to see how time-space interacts with space-time. And so that would be the explanation. And the only thing really that you need to keep in mind as you read the raw material and you watch it interpreted by some guy on YouTube, it'll make sense to you that when they talk about time-space, they're referring to that plane, and when they're talking about space-time, then they're referring to this plane. Now, I do want to play a little bit with the idea of space and time, so I can give you more of a practical way to see this, as opposed to just reading didactically what we're studying. So there is an interdependence of space and time. And now that I have said that, I can liberate some space here. Speaking of space, which is going to take me a little bit of time, but there it is. No more time and more space. So let's use black. For us to have creation, this is why space and time are illusions, but at the same time, I'm going to attempt to explain why space and time are illusions, but are necessary for the creation to be manifested. If we had nothing, absolutely not a thing, then we wouldn't know anything. So we first need to create space, or not first, they're both created at the same time, but let's just, for our imagination, we start with space, and space needs objects. Otherwise, we wouldn't know that there is space. So we need an object to stand out of the background of space. And so imagine that you have a ball, and that ball is in space. The space would be this board without the letters, and this board would be infinite. That would be full space. Now this ball, you couldn't know if it was moving or not because you have no reference point. And so time wouldn't exist. So we need a second ball for us to know that there is movement. And if they are moving, then you would measure time as now is born between the space and the two objects, because one is moving maybe away from the other, or they're moving towards each other. And that would be a measure of time. Time is really our way to measure the movement of objects and things. And of course, the complexity of this density and other densities make up time much more fascinating, which is the slowing of time or the speeding of time. And that depends on our perception of how things are happening. We can play it a lot with this, but this is the basic idea of how there is an interdependence between space and time. You couldn't have one without the other. And this is the simple parameter in which the whole space-time is created, or space and time. Now, to get a little bit more deeper into what this means, let's talk about the 3D screen, which is something that I came up with as I tried to visualize what is the creation, because the creation is nothing created space and thus time was born, or nothing created objects. We're talking about one infinite mass, if you want to call it that. We can call it spiritual mass. But for our visualization, let's call it one infinite mass. Okay, and that infinite mass needs to manifest itself, needs to play with itself, because by itself, it doesn't know anything. And so, because nothing can be born. And so the 3D screen is something that I came up with. If you can imagine this infinite mass, and I'll just draw like a sort of cube. You can imagine that's a cube. And this is a solid, like a screen, if you will, 3D screen. You can project it all the ways. I'm terrible at drawing cubes, but here we go. It's my best attempt. So there is cube, a 3D screen. Now you can imagine that every single photon that exists in our universe is a pixel that is in movement. In fact, energy is electricity that is moving through the 3D screen. And so that movement, or that animation of the 3D screen, is what we call reality, is what we call the evolution of energy towards infinity. And all that's happening is that there is this play of pixels moving around. And now you can see that the idea of space and time is illusory, because it doesn't exist. There is no space, because we're talking about one infinite mass, and that infinity, then you can measure space. And there is no measure of time, because everything is happening always at the same time. There is no true evolution of things that are happening. There is just a playful thing. And this is why we've always, in our ancestors, they have always called the creation, for example, lila. The word lila, which was, it means play. That's what it means. It's just the consciousness playing with itself to create this illusion of space and time. And for that matter, have experiences. Why not? So the 3D screen is actually moving. It's animating. It's not moving, it's animating. And thus it creates the illusion of movement. For example, when you watch a screen, you watch a movie, you're watching movement and planes flying, and you get into the experience of the movie and you feel like you're moving. Or even now with virtual reality, you can feel that you're in a different space, but you're not. Everything is happening in your consciousness. Well, the same thing is happening here. No wonder why we create these devices, because we know how this works. This is our nature. And so this completely shows how space and time are an illusion. The only thing real is consciousness, because consciousness is really the modulation. Consciousness can be understood as the energy that creates the electricity, the ever-present energy that creates the electricity to power this 3D screen. And so everything is being animated and it's being moved for the illusion of the infinite experiences that we can have, and knowing the self through all the different kind of scenarios that are possible. And so that is the 3D screen. And I hope that made sense, because to me, this shows how reality really is without space and without time. They are not real. They're simply for the purpose of experience. And this is why in the video that's coming out next week, go watch it, session 57, part 3, it's only one question that I cover there. Ra explains that space and time never need be considered for the seeker, for the deep seeker. And so the last thing I'll say is the beingness in space, time, and time-space. This is something that Ra explains to us as the interaction that we have in space and time. In space and time, we have a body, and we're moving in 3D space and one time dimension. This is very useful for having experiences and for the myriad of other catalysts that we're experiencing here because we feel that we're running out of time. We have this this urge to do things because time is always on our heels, right? And so we have this incentive to do things, to act. The space-time is the dimension of activity, of doing, whereas time-space is the dimension of beingness. And so I'm sorry that I used the word beingness here, and now it's a little bit confusing, but beingness both in space-time and time-space. So you are more activity and doing here in space-time for reasons, again, that make sense for us to have experiences and explore everything. And then in time-space is the opposite. We don't have much doing. We don't have much to do because now we know complete time. We are no longer living in 3D space and one time. We're living in 3D time and one space. That one space would be our current state. This is why healing and everything else that happens after death is done in time space, because we have an overview of our whole incarnation and all other incarnations. So we have, as it were, time spread out in 3 dimensions for us to explore it. But we can't make changes to our beingness because we know everything in time space. So space, our space becomes constricted and it seems linear. But again, none of this is true. However, for the evolving being, it wants to reincarnate to create more and more of these experiences so it can balance itself and realize in its own nature in time space that it needs to evolve, that's the purpose. This becomes obvious in time space. In space-time, especially in third density, we have the illusion that we may be separate, that we may die and nothing else will continue. This, of course, defies physics at its most fundamental level, that matter cannot be created nor destroyed. And the same applies to energy, and we are energy. So our energy, our inertia of thoughts and everything else, it needs to continue on. So this is the difference of beingness in space-time and in time-space. Here we have the opportunity to actually do both, because in space-time, being more of an illusion, we have the capability of acting as a limited being, yet at the same time we can foster and cultivate this time-space beingness as well, because this is who we truly are. We're closer to our true being in time-space, in meditation, in dream states, in anything that is not in the separate world. But this separate world is very useful, like I said. So the main takeaway here, especially with space-time and time-space, knowing that we have a physical activity and a mental beingness, is to know that our true nature resides more in our beingness and who we are. This is why it's always more recommended by any entity, whether it be incarnate or discarnate, that want to teach us the ways of the truth, that we be more and do less, because our activity is only one that brings us catalyst. Not that catalyst is bad, but saying that our activity is just showing you what the catalyst is coming to us so we can process it. And we do, as humans, spend very little time processing our catalyst, because that's what's coming from time space and we don't know it. So our ignorance is really our biggest detractor, I would say. I was going to say enemy, but it's not really an enemy. It's just what delays everything. And that's the point of this. We're supposed to realize at some point that we are a light being, that we are a metaphysical being and not a physical one. This is why you hear all the time that I am not a human being having a spiritual experience. I'm a spirit having a human experience, but it is closer to the truth that way. So I hope this was helpful to not only explain the simple concept of space, time, and time, space as it's told in the raw material, but also with my beautiful explanations. I called it beautiful. 3D screen. I thought that was pretty informative, at least to me it was. And then the beingness of space, time, and time, space. As always, I'm grateful for you to watch these videos. check out the other content that I have in the raw material. If you have more questions, of course, again, check out this video that explains a lot more, and that is question 33 of session 57, which I recorded already, and it should be out either next week, or if you're watching this, like I said, maybe it's already out after the fact. Thank you again, and I'll see you in the next concept.